It's great to be here. I wanted to thank Engineer, who's a platinum sponsor here, and also who sponsors my travel everywhere, probably too many places. So thank you. I work for them. I'm actually working full-time on Rails pretty much now, as well as helping the solo team. That's been pretty interesting. Solo team, if you guys don't know, actually is a Merb app, but the goal is to get the solo project to eventually become a Rails app once that's viable. So sort of a real in-house experiment of how to make the merge work correctly for one of our own apps, and it's been interesting just to sort of work with those guys. So thank you, Engineer, for getting me here. This talk was originally supposed to be about Merb slices, and it was going to be a code-heavy talk. That didn't really make much sense anymore, since the code heaviness isn't really going to be the same API that you would use in Rails. What we are going to do in Rails, just so that I do my due diligence about the original talk, what we are going to do in Rails is have mountable applications, so that pretty much any Rails application will be mountable into any other Rails application. And that's way cooler than engines or slices. It's going to be a lot of work. I hope we get it into Rails 3. If not, the groundwork will be laid to getting it into a near future release. But that's sort of where we're going. And so talking about mainly the quirks of how to deal with slices in Merb didn't really make that much sense anymore. So I decided to instead give a talk on Rails merging into Merb. And I decided I would start with a bit of esoterica. So this is a fun title. The only problem is that in Ruby, Merb would overwrite all the keys in Rails. So I don't know if anybody knows about this. But actually, I just learned about this pretty recently. The merge method in Ruby actually takes a block for conflict resolution. It's kind of crazy. I don't know if anybody knew that, but that's pretty cool. Actually, there's a bug in Ruby. The reason I know this is there's a bug in Ruby 1.9 that can produce an infinite loop if you merge a hash into yourself and then modify it, which I don't know why Ruby supports it all, but right now it's a bug. But anyway, that's esoterica. What I'm going to talk about is big picture. I want to show off the Merb router a little bit. I'll explain why when we get there, and then Q&A. So what's the big picture? The big picture is that before when we had Rails and Merb, Rails had some pros to it. It's been around for 5 years. It has a lot of features. Most recently added are Unicode, localization, time zones, and it has a pretty kick-ass default stack. David talked about this morning. Rails really focuses heavily on having like a unified experience that anybody can come to, and pretty much you know what Rails is. It has this really good notion of convention. The cons are that if you actually need to do something that's not in those conventions, and obviously there's been a bunch of back and forth about to what extent this is true, but I think it's pretty well understood that in the face of really heavy, crazy customization, Rails is not necessarily, Rails 2.3 anyway, is not necessarily the man for the job. It definitely has a take it or leave it approach to a lot of the components. So in Rails 2.3, you either take the JavaScript helpers or you leave the JavaScript helpers. There's really no middle ground. The code base has been around for a long time. Before I started working on Rails, there hasn't really been anybody working full-time on Rails since David initially extracted it. So the code base sort of grew. And there's a low priority in aggressive performance enhancements. Basically what that means is that Rails team always saw as their main use case the sorts of apps that most people write in Rails, for which cutting out 100 microseconds, not really a big deal. There's a whole other class of apps though, like Yellow Pages, service tier, basically any sort of app that actually has a hello world profile, basically or Twitter, where a lot of the pages are just grabbed from memcache and served back, where shaving 100 or 200 microseconds here and there actually adds up very quickly. So that's sort of the Rails story. Merb sort of came into existence in response to the cons of Rails. So we put together a modular architecture. We made it much easier to swap out ORMs or JavaScript. We actually focused very heavily on performance, specifically the performance of those performance-intensive applications. We focused on, since we were able to rewrite from scratch, we were able to focus heavily on making the code base really clean. And that was also aided by the fact that I was full-time on Merb and was able to actually be very rigorous about what got in. And finally, we supported much more granularity to what you were able to take it or leave. So best example is our authentication component. You could use the basic framework of authentication without necessarily buying into the salted user mix-in component that comes with it. So you can opt out of, you can say, I don't actually want to use the login key as the property name, I want to use email or something, and that works without throwing away the entire component. So we focused a lot of attention on making it easier to opt out granularly. Cons were new. Things like internationalization, time zones that we didn't have, and people were basically just borrowing Rails components, and that didn't work so well. And even though we actually did, like David said this morning, realize that the default stack is important, I think we pretty much knew that from day one, that we should have a default stack. There was still more configuration than Rails, and more than I would have liked, and that was sort of going to be a lot of the attention of Merb 2 was getting rid of that, but Merb 1 definitely has that as a problem, is that even the default stack requires more configuration than I would like. So Rails 3 is basically the best of both worlds. And people have heard this before, Rails 3 is the best of both worlds, I'm sort of laying out for you what that means, right? We're going to have Rails 3 is mature, and a lot of people have asked the question, why don't you just start with Merb? And the answer, honestly, is that Merb is a pretty immature code base, and we probably could have spent 6 months or a year getting it up to spec. We were going to do that. But Rails is already a code base that we know works for, according to Gartner, 1 million people. So regardless of the fact that we all very acknowledge the cruftiness of the code base, it does work for a lot of people today. So basically getting that maturity, getting all the features, getting the notion of a default stack that we would have to work very hard to justify making something less conventional. That's what we got from Rails. From Merb, we're getting an emphasis on performance, agnosticism, granular opt-out, and readable code. So basically, Rails 3 is best of both worlds. What do I mean exactly? Right? So it's hard to actually take apart what these things mean, because during the period of disagreement, there was a lot of attempts on both sides to say, well, that's a bad argument, you can just X, and then this argument is no good. And so an argument that was always made about agnosticism is it's just Ruby anyway, nothing's stopping you from dropping in data mapper, it'll just work. So just do that. And what we mean when we say ORM agnosticism and what Rails now means is actually beyond just it'll just work, it's just another library, use it, it's fine. So I'll show you first what Merb did. Merb had a way of saying use an ORM called data mapper, let's say. And use ORM data mapper was in Merb required even if you were using the default stack. It was generated for you, but there was nothing actually special about the data mapper ORM versus Active Record or SQL, which were also supported. It used the exact same API to set itself up and everything as we expected other ORMs to use. When you said use ORM data mapper, it required a plugin called Merb_data mapper. This is not actually the way Rails' ORM agnosticism support is going to work, but this is sort of the lessons that we took from Merb. And then it supplied some generator components. So when you did Merb gen resource, now it used Merb data mapper to generate the resource. You said Merb gen model, it used data mapper. You said Merb gen resource controller, and it generated from data mapper. And this worked with test suite, worked with template engine, and it worked with ORM. So you basically got a mix. Every component was able to provide for you the little piece that was required for building up something like a resource. And that was actually a big deal. That's beyond, it's just a library, that's actual framework integration, right? That's the framework saying when you are an ORM, you should provide controllers for a resource. You should provide models that respond to properties that are created, right? And so SQL provides migrations, Active Record provides migrations, but data mapper uses auto-migrate. So there's like an API that's built up, and when you say, I want to use data mapper, that plugin, Merb data mapper, has to provide those resources. So we're really talking about full-on integration. Things like Form 4 actually work with just as fine with Active Record, with data mapper, with SQL, with CouchDB, because there's nothing in Merb itself that actually cares. Same thing with our generators. Authentication framework doesn't actually care because the authentication framework simply generates a user model, and then it basically piggybacks on the model generator that comes with Active Record, data mapper, or SQL. So when you say, when Merb generates itself the first time, and you said, I want the data mapper, it'll generate a user model, that contains the data mapper setup. And if you said you wanted active record, it would generate an empty active record model and a migration for the necessary fields. Same thing with session backends. One of the requirements of an ORM plugin is that it provide a session backend for use in the database. So basically, we have plugins for all these, and it worked. And that goes beyond saying it's a library. That's saying the framework is actually providing hooks for ORMs to hook into. So how is Rails 3 going to basically do a similar thing? And it's not exactly clear how this is going to spin out, but the first push, which is basically helper integration, is pretty much complete. And you can take a look at it in my GitHub repo. And it was initially called Active ORM, and I think it moved to Action ORM, or people call it AORM or whatever. But the idea is that there's some new component. I think it's going to end up being called Action ORM as part of Action Pack that serves as a wrapper for ORMs. And let's look at what this means from the framework perspective. From the framework perspective, there's a new module. I think that's actually a class, not a module, called Abstract. And it provides a model attribute and basically wraps new record, errors, and valid. Basically, this allows, if every single ORM can provide a proxy wrapper, and then, so SQL, if you go back, sorry about that. If you go back, you see that you need to provide new record, errors, and valid. By default, new record just asks new record on the model. Errors, it doesn't try to make a default because that's a really complicated thing, and valid just asks valid. SQL actually complies with the normal errors interface, the active record one, and it just provides new record proxies off to new. Sorry if that wasn't so obvious what exactly happens. Here's actually the original helper mechanism. So when you say form for object, it does this. It says HTML options equals if object respond to new record and object is .new record, then do this, otherwise do this other thing. That's basically how, when you say form for some object, it actually knows whether or not to automatically send it off to the new action or the edit action, right? So that's built into Rails. All we have to do now, after ActiveORM exists, is say action equals ActiveORM.for object, and that returns one of those proxy objects I showed you a couple slides ago that pretends effectively to be active record. So just to recap what I just said, each ORM through ORM plugins gets to provide a proxy wrapper that makes that ORM behave like active record. Now, active record and data mapper actually share an API. They both support new record, question mark, they both support valid, and they both support the same errors interface. So they say to ActiveORM, don't actually wrap me, just return myself back. So basically, if you're an ORM, you have two options. Option number one, make yourself behave like active record. If you do that, then you can just tell ActiveORM, don't wrap me, return whatever object it is back. Option number two is you can write a wrapper that basically doesn't ever get used in normal users' use cases, but Rails will use to actually get something that is compatible with active record for use in the internals. So from your perspective, you do this. Probably shouldn't notice a difference, right? And there is no difference except in this case, add_obj is a SQL object. So basically what's happening here is that we are creating a small proxy wrapper. Most of the time, for most people, isn't going to be used, but that you could create for your own objects. Basically what you do is you register a certain superclass or mix-in name. So you can register data mapper resource or active record base or SQL colon model or whatever object you want. And then when you say ActionORM.for some object, it will actually go look up in that table of registered things which object you're a part of, get the appropriate proxy wrapper, send it back. But you as a user don't have to know about any of this. You only have to know about this if you are a ORM user. So that's the solution. It's kind of nice. It's actually very small. It's not a large thing that you have to provide as an ORM vendor yet. We're definitely going to be adding some templating stuff, so that's not the whole story, but this is actually an even better solution than Merb had, so this is kind of nice. The second thing about agnosticism is JavaScript library agnosticism. David was talking about this. This is actually something that I think the Rails guys had sort of come to on their own as clearly a positive thing, positive approach, and I just want to fill in a little bit of the blanks in your head about how this is going to work. No code has really been written yet, but it's pretty clear the direction that we're going to go. So that's not very good. So this is what link to function looks like. Link to function is a pretty straightforward thing. It takes as an argument the name, and then it takes some arguments. Basically, it does this. It takes link to function, here awesome, then it takes some code to run, and then it creates ahref equals pound, onClick equals, and then the name's awesome, brackets, return false, and then so when you click on it, it will run that function. Most people probably haven't used link to function, but it's used internally by link to remote and some other things, so that's basically how link to function works in Rails up to 2.3. Always work this way. Hold on. I'm missing a slide. So the goal is instead is to change it so that you provide, actually, I'm not missing a slide, but that's incorrect. Okay, so here it says link to function, awesome, awesome, and then you see on the bottom, ahref equals pound, and then instead of onClick equals, it just says data hyphen function equals awesome. That data hyphen whatever actually comes from the HTML5 spec. So people probably know about custom attributes in HTML. It was sort of frowned on. People who were like validation Nazis would yell at you if you put in your own custom attribute because it wouldn't validate even though every single browser in the world accepted any custom attribute. And in fact, the early drafts of the HTML5 spec instructed the browser to actually use any custom attribute in HTML that you wanted, but you still got in trouble if you happened to be on a team with a validation person. So HTML5 actually decided to create a new range of attributes, data hyphen whatever you want, which is a new special custom attribute collection that will validate in any HTML5 validator that is up to date. And basically, now you're able to put whatever custom attributes you want. You can say, so here we're hypothetically using data hyphen function. We may use data hyphen rails hyphen function, possibly. But the basic idea is that you use that special data hyphen whatever collection to specify information. And here, the function name is just awesome. And the real interesting part is that there's no actual code here. And what happens is that a library supplied by whatever JavaScript library that you use actually is the thing that hooks into it. So here we have jQuery. It does $a data function. So that's a CSS selector. That means it's a link that has data hyphen function in it as an attribute. And then we bind click live to it. You should look up jQuery if you don't know what that means. And then we basically say window $this.adder data function, which basically gets the function out of it. So you get the awesome name out of it and you invoke it. So little JavaScript voodoo, but basically does exactly the same thing as the simple function case that we did. If you're using prototype, you can do roughly the same thing, $a data function .invoke observe click. It's a little more verbose, but it does pretty much identical. Then you read the attribute. Dojo has dojo.query. It's connect. But the bottom line here is that the same Rails code that's generated, which is data hyphen function equals awesome, is able to be hooked into by any JavaScript library to do the same thing. That way, if you want to switch from prototype to jQuery, prototype to Dojo, Dojo to jQuery, unless you're using explicit snippets of real code in there that are explicit to prototype, what's going to happen is that the Rails generated code remains exactly the same, and all you do is you replace jQuery.rails.js with prototype.rails.js or vice versa. Now JavaScript works. Again, this is something that I think the Rails team had come to on their own without the merger, but this is something that Merb was sort of looking into because we were already agnostic in the sense that we didn't provide any helpers at all. And so we were looking for a way to actually provide helpers in an agnostic way. We sort of knew this was the case. For a long time, jQuery was really the only unobtrusive library out there, but pretty much all libraries now have taken the approach of allowing you to do something like this. So now it becomes pretty straightforward for any library to hook in. Be easy for you to attach it to your custom library. You can write pure JavaScript if that's your thing, and it would just work. It's just kind of nice. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is performance, since we talked about performance as a thing that Rails wasn't focusing as hardcore on. First thing I want to say is that a millisecond is only 1,000 microseconds. So when you think about performance, a lot of people have apps that run 250 milliseconds or something like that. For them, it doesn't actually make sense to go into the microsecond range. But if you're running an app that's returning in 2 milliseconds or 3 milliseconds or something like that, which is the Rails overhead, but in Merb, it's reasonable to have an application that returns in a couple of milliseconds, it is actually worth going into the microsecond range to look for optimizations. If you find something that is 500 microseconds long, that's half a millisecond. So just some perspective. It's not like microseconds are, nobody should ever worry about that. That's too small amount of time. If you actually care about performance for some reason, if you have someone that's telling you we should really use Java, it's much faster, that you can actually get Ruby to perform pretty quickly, which is what I want to talk about. And I've talked about this a little bit before, and I'm just reiterating myself in case you've never seen this before. So there's some things that people say about Ruby, which is basically Ruby is slow. Can't really get slower than Ruby. It's like conceptually very slow. And I don't know, you hear really crazy hyperbolic claims sometimes made about Ruby, basically because of the fact that on programming language shootouts, Ruby doesn't usually perform very well. Here you see Ruby is 208 times slower than ATS number 2, and I guess, 10 times slower or something than Java. So it performs pretty slow, but people aren't really building Fibonacci on Rails, right? People are building real applications, and you actually have to look at how real applications perform. But before I do that, I want to again provide a little bit of perspective. So here is that test, that Fibonacci on Rails test. And you can see that C++ and Java are very fast. Obviously, they're creating binary trees, and you can make a binary tree. I think it's binary tree creation and deletion. You can make one of those and delete it very fast in C++ or Java. But if you actually start looking at other languages, you'll see that the third thing is Python and PHP and JRuby and MRI. Ruby is not that out of range with dynamic languages. It's not egregiously slower, right? JRuby is actually faster than Python to make binary trees and delete them. For whatever, people seem to care about that benchmark. So if you care about it, JRuby is actually faster by a fair amount. MRI seems to be faster. No, I lied. PHP is really slow. JRuby is a little bit slower than Python. But the point is that it's not like these crazy, it must be like orders of magnitude slower than any other language. It is orders of magnitude slower than C++ or Java, that's true, but in dynamic language land, PHP is actually ridiculously slow, and Python, JRuby, and MRI are equivalent areas of sanity. So if you care about that. If you care about Hello World requests per second, this is the graph I showed at Merb camp. The Merb router, which is basically a rack application, is super fast. Merb itself is pretty fast. Rails is still reasonably fast, and things like CodeIgnite or CakePHP. CakePHP is like 90 requests per second or something like that. So PHP is actually super slow. I think Java is faster, around the same as like Merb router. Although when I did this benchmark at Merb camp, we actually stayed up all night. We had like a team of 5 guys running all these benchmarks, and we couldn't get struts installed, which is what we were trying to do. So that's why it's not on the original graph. So I guess that's sort of that's the story. Not to say that it's impossible to get struts. I think we got struts installed, but couldn't get it to actually serve any pages. So anyway, I'm sure it's not that difficult, but it is certainly, we were looking for a pretty simple get up and running, and PHP obviously is pretty easy to get up and running, and Python, we got up and running pretty quickly, and it turned out it was around the same as the green bar, which is Merb. So Merb was in the same range, and Rails is obviously significantly slower, but even Rails, which is obviously quite a bit slower than Merb right now for Hello World, is much faster than CakePHP. So again, for people that are happy to run PHP in production, but talk about Ruby as this crazy slowest thing in existence, actually should be looking at their own language, because PHP is actually the slowest thing ever invented. And actually, if you speak to PHP people, they will pretty much admit this, that it was sort of well known before Rails became the whipping boy that PHP was pretty horrible. But I guess Rails guys lionized PHP enough that we forgot that was the case. Okay, then there's Grails, and this is actually not an awesome benchmark because Grails is sort of in flux, and this is one benchmark that I ran. I'm told they're faster now. fast enough to actually beat us by some margin. But Grails 0.4 versus Rails 1.2, Grails won by a small margin. Merb 1.0 beat Grails 1.1, I guess a couple months ago. Again, I'm told this is no longer the case, but the point is that Grails, which is 85% Java, is coming toe-to-toe with Rails, which is about pretty much 100% Ruby. So Merb and Rails, which are pretty much 100% Ruby, are within range of something that's almost all Java. So again, there's nothing once you actually start doing things with web servers, Ruby has the ability to actually optimize things, so you can end up with really fast web server written in C that everyone uses, like thin or something, and that ends up being a big chunk of the amount of time that's spent on a web request. So Ruby is already fast, and Rails 3 is going to be faster. And that's pretty much the speed story. Obviously, you can write very slow code in Ruby, and I think it's possible to write slower code in Ruby than maybe it's easy to write in Java. That's something that people should be aware of before getting into this. I think Active Record in particular makes it very possible to write very, very slow code. But if you actually care, it's possible to write Ruby code that's on par with any other language, really. Okay, router. So I said I was going to talk about the router. The reason I'm talking about the router is that of all the features in Merb, this is the one that I think most should get into Rails. I think there is pretty good consensus about it. It's also the one that everyone knows ethereally, this seems like a good idea, but nobody actually knows what the Merb router is, unless you've actually used Merb. So I figured show some of the features, probably make it into Rails, get people to know about it. So first of all, what does a router do? It actually does two things. When people think about routers, they don't really think about everything that routers do. Routers actually do two things. The first thing they do is URL matching and mapping, which is basically inbound URL, tell me where to go. They also do URL generation. Actually, that's usually the same component. All Ruby libraries that do routers now also do URL generation. Yeah, this is not going to be so good. So this is a typical static thing where you say, this is the Merb DSL. The Merb DSL is not going to be the Rails DSL. The Rails DSL is going to be much similar to the Rails 2 DSL with basically additions to support Merb features. I'm just showing you the Merb DSL because that's what exists today to support those features. But while it will be supported as an option in Rails 3, the default will be very similar to the Rails 2 DSL. So you can say in Rails match/signup to controller action, and you can say .name basically. So this is pretty much similar feature, and you get back a hash of controller pages action index. Basically the exact same as Rails supports for static. The way you generate in Merb is instead of saying sign up URL, you say URL:signup. Another thing that's added is dynamic segments. This is also supported in Rails, so match/post/:permalink, and it will automatically add it as a dynamic segment. And if you go to /post/access conference, controller's post action is show, and then permalink, which is dynamic segment, access conference, generated with URL:post, permalink, arrow, access conference. So not any different really than the Rails DSL. You can also have multiple dynamic segments. Basically works also like the Rails DSL and generated pretty much the same. Now let's get into features that the Merb router has that the Rails router does not. The first one is optional segments. So in the Merb router, you can add a parentheses around any segment or any part of the match, and it will automatically make it optional. So in this case, /:year is optional, which means that /post/2008/access conference will match, but so will /post/access conference. And you'll get a params hash that comes back with controllers post, action show, year 2009, permalink, access conference. And you generate it, again, using the same approach. Something I didn't show here is that if you did not supply a year, it would know how to generate it correctly. If you did supply a year, it would know how to generate it correctly. Multiple optional segments. So you can actually do optional segments that are nested inside of each other. So that means over there that if you supply a year, you can optionally also supply a month and a day. If you do not supply a year, there's no month and day. And if you do /post/2009/26 access conference, that's the params hash you get back. And you can do URL It will automatically figure out if you did not supply a year, that it doesn't need a month and a day. If you supply a month without a year, it will actually go looking in your current param. So if you're inside of a certain year, so if you have a nested optional segment structure, and this actually works for all segments, if there's a mandatory segment or an optional segment that becomes mandatory because you used an inside one, it will actually look at the current params and figure out where you are in the nested structure and supply them as needed. That way, if you're in some nested structure, and this is actually not that common anymore because of resources, but if you have /foo/bar and you supply only :bar, it'll fill in foo from the current params list. Okay, so nested matches and match validation. So this is also very similar to the Rails, the current Rails DSL. You can say match language, and then you can supply a regex. So this is like Rails requirements. The different thing here is that you can actually nest matches and twos. So here you say match/language, language blah to controller pages. When you nest match/page name, that basically means the language comes first and then the page name. So it's as though you built it inline, but now you get to build it nested. And so it's sort of like with context in Rails, except you can do it multiple times. And you can do it for any part of the DSL. So you can say to controller do, and then put your nested stuff inside. And what comes out of this URL, so I guess merb/book/en/data mapper is controllers, pages, action show, language en, page data mapper. Notice that you can actually put the optional segments at any level of nesting, and basically it combines them to the full segment that you would have created if you would have not nested them. And you can say URL, page, and supply all the details, or you can say URL table of contents, which is the second nested one down there, and it will do the right thing. Okay, so Rails has toParam, which is staying. Merb added a feature if toParam wasn't usable for you, or if you didn't like toParam. It's actually not that common to have these cases, but if you have an object that's coming in off the web or something like that, and you can't easily add toParam to it every single time, or if you have a frozen object, you can't add toParam. Basically, Merb gave you the ability to say identify via permalink, identify via whatever, and that basically lets you say for this route, for resources article, use permalink instead. Now here I show like how you would actually get that information from Merb. So you say Merb : request.new, and then you supply a rack mock request. And then if you say Merb router.match request, you can see that what you get back is action show, controller articles, ID, my article. Now there's a little quirk in the Merb router, which is definitely would be fixed and will not be there in the Rails router, which is that if you specify identify permalink, it actually uses ID here instead of the identified name. However, actually, I should explain this before I say that, however. Merb also adds a new, instead of URL for this, you add something called resource. You can pass in a resource object, and it will go figure out which resource it is attached to and go generate the URL. So it's basically like polymorphic URL4 in Rails, except it's actually smarter than polymorphic URL4 and is the way that everyone in Merb does resources. And I think in Rails 3 what we're going to do is we're going to make URL4 support the same. There were some quirks in Merb that made us need a separate method, but they're not really, they were really backwards compatibility issues for us, and it's possible to make URL4 take the objects and generate the correct information. So actually, you were probably thinking on the last slide, hey, I don't actually want to always have to specify identify. What if I have a class? I want it to always be, permalink whenever it's a video, in this case. And so what we supply is you can just say identify, and then you can provide a class, specify what the identification method is. What's weird is that in this case, it actually does the right thing. This is, again, a Merb quirk. So it actually gives you back permalink in this case. It gives you permalink Rick Astley. This is actually how we would implement toParam in Rails. So in Rails, the default would be identify object arrow toParam. And then it would just work. And in this case, you can see that there's a nested resource users, and nested inside of that is resource videos. And if you say resource at user at video, it returns the full path and basically goes and looks it up in the resources table. Okay, subdomains. So I think there's a plugin in Rails for this. So you can just say subdomains, arrow, and then you can provide basically a regular expression, and it will return if it matches. Otherwise, it will go on to the next route. You can also specify in the Merb router, you can specify a parameter called sub, and then you can say :subdomain bracket 1. What that means is the subdomain segment, which is supplied in the match method, get the first capture out of that. And what you get over here is index, videos, sub, mat. You can also check the request method, like in Rails. Here it's match video / destroy / 12 method delete. This will only match delete method. You can also supply regular expression, or make it case insensitive. I think this is what you have to do in order to actually make it work 100%. You can also check for protocol, match protocol HTTPS to controller payments. Check user agent MSIE or gecko. And you get back, in this case, because we said :user agent bracket 1, it will give us back as params agent MSIE, which is the thing that matched. And actually, the secret of that last 10 slides or whatever is that it actually matches anything on Merb request. So when you set over here, user agent MSIE or gecko, it actually does request, the current request .user agent, and checks to see if it matches MSIE or gecko, and then extracts out the captures, which it then uses when you say agent user agent 1. And this also means that you can add whatever you want onto the request object and have it work just as well. People like this. Basically means that there's no use for any, in the Merb router, for any special magical plugins that add features, because they're pretty much all available on the request object, and you can add them yourself if you would want to. Okay. I actually did not, there's one more feature that I don't have here, but is worth saying, which is that if all else fails, you can say instead of a to, you could say defer to, which is a block. It takes the request object and the parameters and the segments, and then you can return from there either a hash, which means here is the thing that I want to match to. So basically it lets you defer figuring out where to send your user to until later on. The most common use case for this is I want to look up, I have a blog post, it's going to a permalink. I actually want to make sure that that permalink is actually in the database before I send them there. If not, I actually want it to go somewhere else, like maybe a static page. So I want it to check there first and then continue matching if it's not in the database. Some people do this. Also common is to convert legacy URLs over into new URLs. So you can say, match this legacy URL pattern, convert it over, and then in the block, you can basically say if that legacy URL, even though it looked like it matched a regular expression, doesn't actually work, move on. It might match a different pattern. That's not that commonly used, but it's cool that you could if you need to drop down and write raw code right there. So that's pretty much the spiel, the merge spiel, and now I'll take any questions about the merge. Yes?
When are you going to put slices and parts into Rails?
We're going to put slices and parts into Rails. So I sort of addressed this earlier, which is Rails, hopefully 3.0, maybe something soon after that, is going to have mountable applications. So any Rails application will be a slice. Basically means you can write your Rails application as normal, and then one day you could decide, you know what, I want to use this Rails. I made a blog, I actually want to put it inside of another app. And you'll be able to just say, put all the routes for this inside of a namespace called like /blog. And then it will just work. Obviously, it's a little more complicated than that for things like, I would like to supply a thing for my sidebar that goes into every other part of my site from the blog or something like that. So there's obviously some details to work out. But Rails 2.3, courtesy of Josh Peak, already supports the infrastructure necessary to make this happen. So it's really just a matter of doing it, writing the code. And parts, we're doing the abstract controller thing like in Merb. So if it didn't ship with Rails, it would be like 10 lines of code to do it yourself. Yes?
I have a HTML Ajax-based web page charting application.
Okay.
Using Rails, it's kind of too slow because every page will send a request every second, so it's too slow. So right now, with the 2.3, there's something called Metal. I'm wondering whether should I use Metal or should I use wait for the Merb to come out or the Rails 3 to come out?
That's actually a good question. So Rails 2.3, he says he has basically a common polling application. He has a chat room, and the chat room polls every second or something like that to see if there's any new chat messages, basically like Campfire. Rails 2.3 has Metal. Should he use Metal or should he wait for 3.0? As you probably know, the initial solution to this problem with Campfire was just to write it in C. So that was perhaps the original motivation. What happened with Metal is that I think what was realized was that you don't actually have to write it in C. You can write that sort of thing in Ruby as long as you remove the overhead of the whole Rails process. Actually, I was speaking to David about this, and the only reason they wrote it in C as opposed to like a mongrel handler is that when they wrote Campfire, it was like pre-mongrel. So there was no obvious way for them to write it in a fast way. And he said to me that perhaps had they written it post-mongrel in Rack, or the Rack days, they may have just written a middleware as is. Metal is actually basically souped up Rack middleware. It basically works exactly the same as Merb middleware works with some magic added to it to make it load automatically and stuff like that. So I would say do that if you have this problem today. If you have a problem today, do that. What I would also say is that my personal goal for Rails 3 is to moot the need for Metal. So if you actually look at Merb, the difference between a rack request and like going all the way through the controller is not that much. It's like, I think 500 microseconds or something like that, which actually matters in this case, but it's a small amount of time. And so we were always irked by that difference, and we're working on reducing that difference down. My personal goal in Rails is to try to do that, to try to make it so that in a controller, if you need it, you can actually get to a controller in very little amount of time. I've been working on specifically that, basically to make a lot of the lookup. Right now there's a lot of expensive lookup, and there's callbacks and a whole bunch of stuff that you can't get out of. And what I want to do is make a lot of that lookup just a hash lookup, basically. So callbacks, if people have been reading my blog, are now basically a method call. So it's method call, a few method calls done instead of like an iteration and checks against procs and all this stuff. It's actually not doing that anymore. And so basically going through all the places where controllers are slow now and making it so that getting to them is very fast is a goal of Rails 3. In the meantime, Rack middleware, Metal, something like that, is probably good. It's probably what I would do.
Will that automatically, will Rails 3 automatically fix my problem?
Probably not.
Oh, I'm just wondering.
If you write Metal today, I'm assuming Metal will work on Rails 3. I don't think Rails 3 will automatically fix problems, though, like magic.
I have the Rails 2.2 code already.
Oh, you're saying it's just a little slow now. Will Rails 3 Rails 3 will definitely make it faster, and it will be possible to opt out of some things in the controller to make it even faster, for sure. I don't know.
So in Rails 3, do I still change my code to make it fast? Or
Rails 3 is not going to be out for a while. So like if you have a slow app today, waiting for Rails 3, probably not a great idea. But if you could wait, it will be like Merb speed probably. That would be my guess, which is like 500 microseconds slower than a rack request, which is probably fine for you, for your case. Yes? Do I test all the fucking time?
We've had this discussion already today. Do you sleep 8 hours a night? I'm kind of worried about you. You're coding, you're traveling, you're talking. Do you take care of yourself either?
I do sleep sometimes at night, usually. Any other questions? Yes?
What are the plans for merging the unit tests and all the tests into frame?
So we're definitely still using test unit. I think that was the only thing that the Merb guys had to just unequivocally give up in the merge. And that's because we're mainly, as David said this morning, using Rails as a base. And like I said earlier, the main reason for this is that it can't really be done the way people think it could be done, which is like build the quirks of Rails on top of Merb. It doesn't really work that way. So we actually need to extract out Rails, be like, oh, okay, I may have said this before, layout arrow nil in Rails is actually the same as layout arrow true. This was not obvious when I started working on it, but it became obvious, and then I was able to go and be like, this is weird. Layout arrow nil is the same as layout arrow true. Is that purposeful? Turned out not to be, but it's not really possible to figure that out the other way. So having a big suite of tests that could confirm that we're not breaking things as we make modifications is kind of necessary, and porting the RSpec ones didn't make sense. I think we'll probably port the router tests over, just because there's like a ton of them. I think a third of the Merb test suite is the router tests. Probably want to continue having those. Like a sort of tangential question is, what about people who want to use RSpec? And we're definitely going to be working more directly with the RSpec guys now than the Rails guys have in the past to make it work well. Make it so that if you're like on Rails Edge, typically RSpec will work, which is not always the case now. So, yeah. Yes?
So your branch of it is the stuff where all the merging is happening?
The merge is 2 stages right now. I'm doing a lot of sort of going through Action Pack, making a lot of changes, putting it all together, make sure all the tests pass, and then there's I show it to like Josh or somebody else to look at it. The last time I did that, he had a whole bunch of questions. I answered them, I made a bunch of changes, and then we merged it into 3-0-unstable on the Rails thing. So 3-0-unstable is like a stable version of my changes.
So that one, so like if you want to incrementally keep our apps, update them as it's going rather than one thing at the end, that unstable.
3-0-unstable is probably the way to go. I will say though that we're not actually attempting to make it plugin compatibility be true for Rails 3. So like acts as whatever that it works on 2.3 will almost certainly have to be modified to work on Rails 3. I anticipate that this will happen. We're definitely going to be working directly with people, calling people up, going and finding people who have popular plugins and making sure that everything works. But in the interim, you'll probably see a lot of breakages from plugins that currently hook into the internals in ways that will no longer be necessary. So you might do that, but if you see, it's probably, if you're actually interested in being actively involved and actually calling up the plugin guys and saying, you should probably update it, there is no longer a method called in the internals. That's fine. Yeah. Yes?
Are the actions in Rails 3 going to be like Merb, where they explicitly return something like a string or a proc, or is it going to be all auto-render like Rails has been?
That's a big question that we've been wrestling with. I think initially we had hoped to be able to support both options, and maybe that's still possible. So it turns out to be a much more complicated problem than it appears at first glance. It seems at first glance like you could just say, was there something rendered yet? If so, use that. Otherwise, render. Or if there's something rendered, use the return value or something like that. But you can create a whole bunch of cases. Like if you do like log something, you do render and then you say like logger.info blah. It's an ambiguous case and you can't really figure out what the intent was. So there's a good chance that what's going to end up happening is that it'll be more like Rails. I think what I hope is that we're going to make it possible to turn on like a Merb-ish mode, because it sounds like you want the existing Rails way.
No.
Okay.
I just knew that was a one or the other situation where a lot of these things you can just sort of give a little, but it's either got to return a string or it's either not. So you have to pick one way.
Yeah, it turns out, I think what's really interesting about that case is that we thought when we started talking about it that it was really important to us, and it didn't turn out to be, which I actually find to be rather interesting. I think there's a lot of people in the Merb community who take on faith that certain things, or who have been convinced that certain things are important, and believe that more fervently than the Merb team. So this is one of those cases where a lot of people think it would be like pretty horrible if we had to give on this, and we basically sat down and pretty much every one of these discussions is we'll say, okay, we think this is important, and DHH and Jeremy and Josh will say why. And we'll say, okay, here's the 10 arguments that we've made in the past. And they'll say, well, these 8 arguments can be dispensed with by making this tweak to how it works right now. And we'll say, that's true. And so now what about these other 2 cases? And a lot of times we'll end up with, okay, we sort of have to give up on that case. I think in the case of this, it turned out that we personally felt like it allows for cleaner internals, but weren't able to really quantify that. All the user-facing concerns that we had were possible to be handled. So it's possible for people to program as though they were returning strings easily. So, and we personally think that that's the way you should be. You should always have meaningful return values, but it doesn't really, whether or not that's actually what's going on behind the scenes is not really very important to the user. So that's the story. Any other questions? Okay, if not,